All right, we are at 12 o'clock, and it looks like we have some people still trickling in, but I think we should get started. And it's my pleasure to be able to welcome all of you to the Brice Acree Memorial Lecture featuring David Lazer. I'm Professor Braumoeller of the Department of Political Science and TDAI. And I'd like to start by thanking TDAI for hosting this lecture and the Department of Political Science for co-sponsoring it. Now, some of you didn't know Brice, while others will never forget him. He was a computational social scientist who worked primarily in the areas of text as data and machine learning. He was also a decent, kind, and funny person, a natural father, an outstanding teacher, and a generous colleague and mentor. The news of his death last year at age 32 shocked and saddened his colleagues and friends. It's only appropriate to have a computational social scientist of David's caliber here to deliver a lecture dedicated to his memory. Before we begin, though, we have an award to convey, and for that, I'm going to turn you over to Greg Caldeira, Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science.
Thank you, Bear. Last year, well, normally we give a teaching prize to the faculty member who best has deserved it that year. And we normally award it in our spring award ceremony, but because of the pandemic, we canceled it. And as we were planning today's session, it occurred to us that nothing could be more fitting than to make this award to Brice Acree in memoriam. One of the things that happened in the wake of his death is that many undergraduates and graduate students came forward to testify to the important role he had played, not only as a teacher, but also as a mentor and a friend. And therefore, I am pleased to award to Brice Acree and to Lauren, who is here with us, in his honor, the 2020 Distinguished Teaching Award for the Department of Political Science. I'll read a couple of open-ended comments from his teaching evaluations. One of the courses he taught most frequently was our undergraduate quantitative analysis course. In that course, many of the students, most of the students there are not there because they're interested in quantitative analysis particularly. They are filling requirement. What they said of Brice, many of them, was his great clarity, his warmth, his ability to make complicated ideas very simple, his friendliness, his positive outlook, his engagement, and his availability always to help undergraduates. So it's my honor, and I'll see if I can pull up the, let's see, share screen, show you what we gave him. Let's see if the screen, is that showing? Should be a globe. I don't know whether you're seeing it. A beautiful copper globe. And it's a small token of our appreciation and appreciation of the undergraduates and graduate students who benefited so much from Brice's presence here. And so I'll turn it over.
So I think next we have Ricardo Graiff Garcia, who will talk briefly about Brice as a teacher.
Sure. My camera appears to me as if it's frozen on a frame of me looking very weird. I don't know if that's accurate. I'll stop it and start it again and see if that does anything. All right, here I am. So first, if I may, this is very difficult for me. So if I ramble, I apologize. Because there's so much, right, that I can say about Brice as a teacher, as a mentor, as a professional, as a role model. So much I can say about his dry, quiet, understated sense of humor that I remember fondly. At the same time, it's almost paralyzing to try to talk about him coherently. I was his TA for 3 semesters. So it was the fall of 16, the spring of 17, and the fall of 17. And I thought I would maybe share the story of my first interaction with Brice, which I think encapsulates a lot of things about who he was as a teacher and as a mentor. I was assigned to TA his undergraduate quantitative methods class, and I knew a little bit about his work, and I knew that his stuff was really, really, really cool. And I was intimidated, and the intimidation only grew when, before the semester started, he sent me an email. The subject line was something like expectations for the semester, and I opened it, and before reading, I noticed that it was an extremely long email with a huge numbered list. And I thought, man, this guy's gonna make me work so hard. And then as I got to reading it, I noticed that every item on his big numbered list was something that I would not have to worry about. Things like you grade homeworks, but you don't have to grade exams. If a student emails you complaining about a grade, send it to me. If the parent of a student emails you with a complaint, send it to me. He later would tell me that that happened to him in graduate school at some point. But that was Brice. The whole time I worked for him, that email was such a great example of who he was, because he was very thorough. He was always several steps ahead, especially of me. But he had this very reassuring style, which was reflected in his classes. The material was very demanding and he was very rigorous, but he had this warmth to him that made it feel like you could, for a minute, keep up with him and with his work. And that combination of rigor and thoroughness on the one hand and warmth on the other is very rare. And it's the reason why he's had such an impact on my professional life, on his students, on other graduate students that he worked with. And to me, it reflects his constant desire to help us grow and his focus on our needs and our positions and our struggles. Apart from that, Brice was always very generous to me with his time, his words, his wisdom. I knocked on his office door many times asking for advice, and he would always talk to me for as long as I needed. And these are things that I will never forget. And I'm sure there are many, many others on this call who had similar experiences and who feel the same way. So sorry if I took too long, but again, it's very hard to speak coherently about Brice. But I'll turn it over now. Thank you also, by the way, for the opportunity to let me say a few words about him, because he means a lot to me and this means a lot to me. So thank you all very much.
No worries, and thank you very much, Ricardo. Next, we'll turn to Greg Caldeira, who has an announcement about an initiative in the Department of Political Science.
Yes, I do. Deb, if you could flash up the PowerPoint. Right. So we have begun a fundraising for the Brice Acree Memorial Fund. Who the initial goal is to put up a plaque in the Arboretum in his honor. And second, when we reach that goal and are able to purchase that, we'd like to contribute to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and Scholarship Fund. And at present, we are at about 2/3 of the initial goal toward putting up a plaque. So please donate. This PowerPoint slide tells you precisely how to do so. It's really a worthy goal, and we hope that you will take part. Thank you. Michael?
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, I was going to say, and finally, I'll hand it over to Michael Neblo to introduce David.
Thanks, Bear, and hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's event. Our speaker, David Lazer, is University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Computer and Information Science at Northeastern University. Prior to Northeastern, he served on the faculty at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he remains a visiting fellow. As a leader in computational social science, it could not be more fitting that David should present the inaugural Brice Acree Memorial Lecture. David has published award-winning, highly cited work on a dizzying array of topics. In the interest of disclosure, I should mention that over the years, I've had the great good fortune to co-author 14 papers in a book with David. I had to look that up, I had lost track. One of the real highlights of my career. But those joint projects constitute only one of the many waves of research David continues to produce. I could go on. Indeed, I was tempted to write a whole encomium on David as a wide-ranging scholar, invaluable public intellectual, and extraordinarily decent human being. But in addition to being all of those things, David is also humble and would not have approved of me puffing him up with a litany of his many accomplishments. More importantly, doing so would cut into the valuable time we have today to engage with his ideas. So without more well-deserved praise, I am honored to give you my esteemed colleague and dear, dear friend, David Lazer.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone. It's a particular honor to speak. I think there's a particular gravity for this presentation, so I'm honored to have been invited to speak. And also it's nice because I have so many friends at OSU. I look at the audience and I can see at least 4 people I've written with. I see 2 people I went to grad school with, people like Greg, whose work on social networks actually inspired me way back when there weren't many people doing social networks in political science. So this is special for me in multiple ways. So let me share. Whoops, sorry. I just need to share screen and make sure I share the right thing. And present. I'm hoping should see a blank screen. I want to talk today about the prevalence of fake news, mainly actually in 2016. We'll have a few little updates on misinformation or fake news around COVID-19. I'm gonna focus in part on the substantive stuff, but I want to also focus some on the issue of counting. And I think again, I wish I'd had the opportunity to meet Brice, but I'm familiar with his work, that the issue of rigorous counting in computational social science, which he did with such care, is something that it needs to be wrestled with always. And I'm going to pay a special attention to the challenges of counting. And you'll get more insights why. So I should note this is mostly drawn from a 2019 paper. And so I should acknowledge in particular my co-authors on that, Nir Greenberg, Kenny Joseph, Lisa Friedland, Brian E. Swire Thompson. I think there's also a lesson here just in the nature of the collaboration, because this was a collaboration among 3 computer scientists, a cognitive psychologist, and a political scientist, myself. And I think that a lot of this work really does require multiple perspectives, multiple skills, and that we need to think about how we do social science differently in the 21st century, because I think it does require these breaking out of our silos and reorganizing the academy. So let me begin with a question. Does Finland exist? I'm guessing most of you think the answer is yes, but there was a spoof post in Reddit that then spurred actually a pretty vigorous debate about whether indeed Finland exists. And it does seem certainly that some people actually take this as a serious question, that Finland actually is a fictional country. And that the reason why people believe it is the outcome of a conspiracy. And the key elements of this conspiracy is that Finland is really the result of an agreement between Russia and Japan, that it was part of the resolution of the Russian-Japanese War in the early 20th century, which gave Japan exclusive rights to fishing in the Baltic Sea in the area that we think of as Finland, and that Finland keeps other boats away. And that the conspiracy is pretty vast. It involves, forged GPS and satellite imagery, for example. And the clincher to the argument is that no country in the world could possibly be that good. Now, I want you to hold that in your mind for a moment as to like this little community there that believes that Finland does not exist. And think about the fact that the Finland deniers, get to vote like everyone else, and to think about, how democracy works. And democracy, democracy is many things, and I'm not, if you have hard questions on democracy, I'll say go talk to Mike. But in some sense, some of the essential premise of democracy is that we have choices and that we have at least some understanding of our choices. And this is apropos, given that the election was just a couple of weeks ago. Indeed, maybe in some sense it's still going on. And that knowledge and how we get information about the world is just really critical to that, right? Like if we were just delusional about our choices, then, and there's utterly no relationship between our choices and the reality, then, democracy as a normative construct is worthless, arguably. And so thinking about how we garner knowledge about the world is essential for really thinking about democracy. And this is just part of I think one of the critical enabling structures of democracy. That is, we read stuff online, we read newspapers, we watch TV, we talk to people. There are, of course, other structures, whether they're talking about the Electoral College or whether, the nature of representative democracy and so on. But in some sense, how we get information is part of that, those softer or less visible structures that enable democracy. Here, I'm going to focus on, the knowledge and how we understand those choices. And fake news is just a piece of that, but I'm trying to use that as a sort of, as an entry point into that bigger question. And, unsurprisingly, I study networks, so I see networks around lots of places, but I do think that knowledge is intrinsically a network phenomenon in the sense that we directly observe very little. Like I could say, there's a book, I have a book on my shelf called How Behavior Spreads, right? And you have to trust me when I say that. Now, I'm going to take this down and I guess it's sort of opposite order, but you can see that I indeed do have that. And now that's something that you've witnessed in that sort of 2020 Zoom kind of way. But there was a moment there that you sort of had to trust me. And really there's all very, very little that that any of us can directly know, that most of our information about the world is mediated by people, by institutions, and that all sort of comes in, through our senses in various kinds of ways. And as a result, we have diverse understandings of the world, and that's just intrinsic to democracy, to society. And in some sense, democracy is what happens in the spaces between our often clustered understandings of the world. And democracy can sometimes, I think, get into trouble, as we sort of gotten some sense of, when those understandings become too divergent and too diverse. So why do I believe in Finland? I've seen it on maps. It's been mentioned in history books and newspapers. I've co-authored with people who claim to be Finnish. I've had a Finnish postdoc in my lab. And it seemed like the most sensible hypothesis about the world, that Finland actually does exist and that it's not a vast conspiracy. But the reason why I believe that is because of this. I can't pinpoint the point in my life that I became a Finland believer. It's just sort of been bombarding me from different places in what I read and hear and so on. So of course, of course Finland exists, but there's that question of why, how do I know? And it's because of this network of informational influences. So today I want to talk about fake news, and I'll define exactly what I mean by that in a moment. But it's really trying to get at some of the issues around the role that social media plays, and I'll note that this is really meant to be just a very narrow slice into that much broader set of topics. But like part of the question here is like this is really, I think this is really important, and in life and research you have to take your narrow slices and try to build the bigger picture. But as I was saying earlier, I think apropos of the moment, I think that the story within the story is a methodology, how to derive real insights regarding fakery. That the very nature of the phenomenon is trying to mess with your understanding of the world, and part of what it's trying to mess with is your understanding of how common it is. And so we need to reflect on that. I should note this builds on a couple of papers. One was sort of an overview paper on the science of fake news, and the other is the main empirical component I'm going to be talking about here, which is fake news on Twitter during the 2016 presidential election. So, fake news in the 2016 election. Well, how do we define fake news? I think we have a very specific definition. There are many flavors of misinformation. Here, we would say fake news is misinformation that has the trappings of legitimately produced news. It looks like a newspaper, but it's made up content, right? That it doesn't have the underlying organizational processes or mission. It's not bad news or unfavorable news coverage. Obviously, that's how it's been used by our president with some frequency, that anything that reflects negatively on him is called fake news. That, in fact, actually is why some in the field have argued that we shouldn't use the term fake news. I think, though, it's a very specific but important subgenre of misinformation, and I haven't heard another compelling structure or linguistic phrase, but it's particularly pernicious because it undermines legitimate sources of news. That is, in some sense, the point of fake news may not be for you to get to believe this particular bit of craziness, but really to undermine your trust in all news, which then potentially would undermine systems of accountability. So, to get a sense of how far back concerns about fake news goes, this is a really lovely article in Harper's Monthly titled "Fake News in the Public: How the Press Combats Rumor, the Market Rigor, and the Propagandist." And it talks all about the role of technology in facilitating the rapid spread of misinformation, and using very contemporary language that feels very familiar and very contemporary. This article was written in 1925. And in some sense, the concerns about fake news go along with the rise of the professionalization of news, that the desire to have news that are somehow an objective portrayal of what's happening in the world is something that's really a 20th century phenomenon. And the term has really bumped up and down really through the last 100 years, especially. It dates even to the 19th century. And it came up quite a bit, especially during the lead up to World War II and during World War II, where there were concerns, rightful concerns about manipulation of the news media in various ways. Of course, the mechanics have changed quite a bit since that 1925 article, and that's partly, that's a lot of what I want to talk about today. And I want to get into just a very specific set of questions, looking at one particular medium, because again, one has to take these narrow and very careful slices of understanding how things work. Three questions are: what was the frequency of fake news exposure and sharing among voters on Twitter in 2016? Which individuals were predominantly affected by fake news? And finally, how does fake news fit into the broader information and news ecosystem? And I'll get at the specifics of that in a few minutes. So first question, why Twitter? I think there are a bunch of reasons why. I mean, there are obviously many media that we use to get information, many social media. And there's one important practical element, which is that Twitter is accessible. It is much more accessible than, say, Facebook. And I can talk a little bit about Facebook if people are interested in a few minutes. It is, but it's also, I think, in some ways, particularly important in contemporary society for making statements of public import, in some senses, it's very much the public square in a way that is not the case with more closed ecosystems like Facebook. Also, I think that it's at least on the surface seems like it's a place that fake news should succeed, because it's not, quickly retweeting something. It doesn't encourage careful scrutiny. Arguably, it creates careful conditions. It creates excellent conditions for sharing of misinformation and fake news. And clearly, it doesn't take long if you go onto Twitter to find areas that are dysfunctional. So we know a cursory look does highlight that. Well, there are at least some problems, some places on Twitter. So again, the story within the story is the method and thinking about counting on social media. The question here is how to count in a house of mirrors. And this image here is meant to both be a metaphor, but also a literal representation of the challenge, because we could imagine taking some computational approaches to image analysis and saying, how many people are in this picture? And most computational methods you might devise would not capture the fact that this is mostly one person and it's just reflections of that one person. And there are some people in the way back, but mostly it's just this one person who gets reflected again and again. And so if you had some algorithmic approach that was saying how many people are in this picture, it would almost surely get it wrong. Now, the reality is I wouldn't lose sleep over this particular problem because there aren't that many House of Mirrors pictures out there that would distort most of our research. But the problem with fake news is that it's trying to fool us. And it's probably also trying to fool us not just about the world, but also about how prevalent it is. And this just fits into, I've had a broader argument about how we should, some of the challenges of taking these kinds of digital trace data. I think they have some enormous strengths over, say, survey data, because they capture real behavior. They're much faster, which allows, there are certain things that scale allows you to achieve in terms of looking at small subpopulations, looking at dynamics, looking at systems rather than individuals who are assumed to be detached from each other. But the weakness is that there's vast heterogeneity, and there's also massive manipulation on most of these platforms. And we discussed some of these issues in this paper over here, the parable of Google Flu. So Twitter, let's look at this in the particular conundrum that Twitter presents, which is Twitter. I'm on Twitter, but so is Donald Trump, and so is General Motors, and so is Ohio State University, and we're all, if you have an analysis at the handle level or at the tweet level where you don't differentiate kinds of actors, they all get pooled together, and then also pooled together, of course, with bots. And there's some estimates that most content on Twitter comes from bots. But even those estimates are questionable. And so let's imagine, by way of analogy, if you were studying nutrition and you said, we're just going to study the tonnage of food that you consume each year. We're not going to differentiate whether it's Campbell's soup or salad bar. There actually may be some findings you get from that if you aggregate it in that kind of way and say, how many tons of food did you consume in 2019 and 2020, if you could measure, but it would be really hard to interpret what that was telling you about the world. Or maybe it's telling you that people who eat a lot of processed food, say, are less healthy or something like that. But that's not a, you would really want to distinguish between lettuce and Campbell's soup. So what we did, and we discussed this more in the paper, and is that we wanted to build a sample of voters on Twitter, and we took, in particular, regular people, and homogenizing our sample. And so what we did was, and this builds on work by Pablo Beber and others, we took available voter files, and we matched them, which also then allowed us not just to say that these were sort of regular people. I mean, it turns out that they're, regular people encompass a lot of different types, but also it gives you links to some basic demographics like age and gender, and to some extent race. So again, the thing is that we are trying to weed out the corporations, the bots, and if people are familiar with this famous cartoon on the internet, Nobody Knows Your Dog, we also want to weed out the dogs, right? I mean, like this to me was like one of the most insightful bits of commentary on the internet ever, which is that if you're trying to come up with some type of science off of the internet, and this is from 1994, that kind of cloaking of what the kind of entity is a real challenge. So what we did, and I'm not going to go into it a great deal here, but just again to the essence, is that we were looking at people who were unique for a given geographic area in the Twitter data, as well as in the voter data. So for example, I am the only David Lazer in Massachusetts on Twitter. Turns out David is very common, but my last name, especially spelled the way it is quite uncommon. And I'm also the only David Lazer on Twitter who names Massachusetts as a location. So I would be matched. Now, that could be, this is a very conservative criterion, although it's not perfect. Like, let's say there's a David Lazer who's 17 years old and not in the voter data, but who tweets a lot. Maybe they're in Massachusetts, identify they're from Massachusetts, and then we wrongly match the wrong David Lazer. But it would require it require a conjunction of fairly unlikely circumstances. We had for this particular paper, we had 2 million, we had a random sample of 2 million registered voters. Ultimately, we were able to match roughly 1% of them. And we're guessing that's roughly probably only 20% of them were on Twitter, which means that we probably had a 5% match rate effectively. Just as a side note, this does create certain kinds of biases in our data. It means that we focus on unusual names. So no John Smiths. It would be very hard to match John Smith. Because there's just too many of them, it really requires names that are geo-unique. And also means that we were focusing on information that people put in their profiles. And there are various reasons for that. There are various ways to do geo-inference, but this was one where clearly someone's trying to disclose their location if they put their location in their profile. And so people may vary in where they put geo-information. We actually have a paper under review right now that compares different methods to create panels. It's a paper with Pew Research Center. They had created a very high quality but much smaller sample where they asked people to volunteer their Twitter handles. And like there are these biases that creep in that are illuminating. So for example, it turns out that women have statistically less common names. We vary the names of our of women or girls when they're born more than boys. I don't know why that is, but it does create that cultural practice does actually create some algorithmic biases in our matching. That is, we match more women than we match men. Not a huge bias, but it is a bias. And in contrast, when you ask people to volunteer their handles, men are more likely to volunteer their handles than women. So there are these interesting biases that pop in, and I'm happy to share that paper with folks if people are interested. But generally, when we're comparing to Pew survey data, our demographics come pretty close across a wide variety of important things. So, there are certain biases. I don't think that anything I'm presenting here it will be dramatically affected, although, that deserves additional testing. We focus on political news, and we have, and there are 3 elements as we define political news. We're only looking for tweets with external URLs. The idea there is that we're focusing on domains that share content that is wrong or misleading, and that the credibility of the assertion on Twitter is borrowing from the fact that it may look like legitimate news. We were looking at data from August to December 2016, and then we trained a classifier for detecting political tweets. Thus, in terms of the URL on the left, or the tweet on the left, and there's sadly a lot of fake news and misinformation about George Soros, because it refers to an external story that makes it look, we call that fake news. The thing on the right, which is talking about Pizzagate, which was another bit of misinformation, is not leaning on the borrowed credibility of a seemingly legitimate news source. So that's misinformation, but it's not fake news. It's not to say that the thing on the right is unimportant. It's just to say that what we're talking about right now is a very particular subset of misinformation that may be important. So, I won't go too much into the classifier other than to say that we started out with a white list of terms like Donald Trump, and then we would learn or detect new terms that were relevant in the moment, like Access Hollywood became very relevant in October 2016 abruptly. It was not relevant before, but it suddenly started co-occurring with Donald Trump. And so like a term like that would potentially be identified as being political suddenly. So like suddenly a tweet that says Access Hollywood that doesn't mention Donald Trump would be identified as political afterwards, not before. So it doesn't go back, it just goes forward, because political language evolves very dynamically depending on the events of the day. So then the next challenge is, how much do people see? And we don't, Twitter, a lot of Twitter research relies on what you can see on the API. That is what you can extract, allow to extract from the platform. So for example, you can extract what someone shares pretty easily, but you can't extract what they've seen, right? You can't see what I've looked at or clicked on Twitter. And so we wrestled with this. I mean, Twitter can see this, but we can't see it. And so our question was, how can one estimate exposure on Twitter without having privileged access to Twitter server logs? And so what we did was we had these 16,000 people we had matched to the voter data. And of course, we can look at their behavior, as I just mentioned. We can see everything that they share and everything they tweet and retweet. But then we extracted everyone that our panelists follow. So let's say I follow Michael and Bear on Twitter. So you would extract, if I were in the panel, you would extract that I follow Michael and Bear, on Twitter. So they would be my followees, right? They may also be following me. They may be followers and followees, but for present purposes, we just care about who the people in our sample follow. And so what we did was we recreated a sample of their potential news feed. Because we had access to something called the decahose, which is sort of a, roughly speaking, a random 10% of what people tweet. So we could look at everyone that our panel followed, and which was millions and millions of people, and which would be too much to get data from, right? That's just would overwhelm our systems. But we did have the 10% sample, and that allowed us to estimate, to come up with point estimates of the composition of what our panel members could see. Now, I should note that that this is both interesting and imperfect because it's not actually showing us what they saw. What they actually saw would have a lot. All of this is algorithmically curated, and so it could be that Twitter figured out some of what you would like to see, and thus you see some stuff from some people and not other stuff from other people, and so it's imperfect. Although we are developing methods actually for volunteers to have monitoring software, all with consent, et cetera, so that we could see what they saw on Twitter. And that way we could distinguish what you could have seen versus what you did see versus what you actually clicked on. But that's like a SQL project that's percolating in the lab right now. So data summary is we have 16,000 or so panel member accounts. There are, between what they could have been exposed to versus what they were sharing, that's $10 million URLs analyzed. And then in terms of exposures, there's literally hundreds of millions of potential exposures, very few of which anyone actually ever saw, right? Like you probably see a fraction, at the time, the industry estimate was people saw 5% of what they could see, and I'm sure it's like a tiny fraction of that now, that you really see very little of what you could see, which again is this huge conundrum for the field. So how do we operationalize fake news? We're focusing on that notion of organizational process, and we can't really observe the organizational process. We weren't gonna try getting on the phone with some of these, with outlets, to interview them about their processes. But what we did was, well, there are a few things, and some of this is just sort of practical, but basically the idea is that if you repeatedly share crazy stuff, you probably don't have great editorial processes. And so what we relied on first was an initial list that had already been used in the literature which we'll call the blacklist, black-coded sites, where from a set of fact-checking organizations as sites that just were consistently sharing misinformation. To expand the set, we used Snopes to identify additional publishers or sources that had false claims according to Snopes, and then we manually annotated those domains in terms of how egregious the claims were, how repeated they were, and we coded them as red, orange, yellow, and green. And we're focusing here on red and orange as having particularly, problematic content. So this gives you some examples. The blacklisted sites were just fictional sites like abcnews.com.co. It's not ABC News. It's a site pretending to be ABC News. The red listed sites were, had major falsehoods with little regard for truth, and then the orange with, had, occasional falsehoods. A lot of the orange stuff was clearly very tilted partisan-wise, but not necessarily false. So what did we find? Well, in some sense, these are simple things we're looking for. I mean, how you get there is not so simple. So, for example, we can say, how much of all the news in the news feeds that people were exposed to, so whereas of news content was fake news. So the numerator there is fake news, and the denominator is all news related content, whether fake or non-fake. And that number that we produce when we do that exercise is 5.1% of political content in voters' timelines was fake news, which is neither, tiny nor enormous, right? It would be different if I had said it was 0.05 or 0.5% versus 50%. It's something. It's substantial but not enormous, arguably. But then that begs the question of the distribution, right? Because like you could have, one person that could be evenly distributed among everyone, or it could be one person just consumed of our 16,000. It'd be sort of a ridiculous consume just incredible amounts of fake news. And so, again, this is sort of a very simple depiction, but what we did was just characterize the cumulative density function. What on the x-axis, what percent of, if you took the top 0.1% of panel members, how much of all exposure of these different kinds of categories do they account for? And what we see is that the top 0.1% for the red and black categories account for 50% of all exposure, and the orange is somewhat less than that. And then the blue line is political news content. Now, even political news content is quite concentrated, but it's not nearly as concentrated in terms of exposure as our fake news categories. Roughly speaking, 1% of our panel members account for 80% of exposures or potential exposures. But if you think that's concentrated, sharing is even more concentrated. We found out of our 16,000 accounts, 16 accounts were responsible for 80% of the fake news sharing. So news sharing, again, is generally actually pretty concentrated, a lot more concentrated than fake news. Than exposure, but sharing is just fake news is just extraordinarily concentrated, and indeed we're limited even what we can say usefully about those 16 accounts because there are only 16 accounts. We've actually since scaled this up, so we are working on a sequel paper on super shares. So, who are these people and what's going on with these super shares and somewhat less super exposed people? On the super spreaders, are the accounts human, or maybe they're really bots? What are they doing? Well, in terms of our match data, and this is just more anecdotal, they lean Republican. They were more women than men, and they were older than the average substantially older than the average Twitter users. That's again, interesting. Some of those general patterns actually hold up. Interestingly, in the larger, when we look at the larger data, that it does tend to be more Republican, more women, and older. And we're trying to dig into why that is still. We actually don't think they're bots because these are, for the super shares, actually have a much more substantial virtual presence than beyond Twitter. So if they're bots, they're very fancy bots. But we did find various kinds of evidence that they are cyborgs, that they have, there are some systematic patterns of saying via at some other account that suggests that some of this may be relying on automation. Maybe some of it is relying on shared email lists of here are the tweets to reshare today. Generally, I think that there's a segment, I would argue, or I suspect that there's a segment of the population for whom posting a lot on Twitter is a kind of political activism, and they use additional tools to facilitate flooding the platform, or trying to flood the platform. Among the 99% who saw, not just looking at that extreme, who saw fake news and who shared it, here we're looking at, we're going to start out by looking at political affiliation. We make certain kinds of inferences based on, actually we're developed by Pablo Barbera and others to make to infer, since we know who are Democrats and Republicans, we can also say which news outlets tend to be consumed more by Democrats and Republicans, and then what does that tell us about people whose partisan identities we don't know, and ultimately we use that as a way to come up with a continuous partisan score for everyone in our panel, even for people who don't share political content. So, and I'll note, just as a side note, when we look at other efforts to come up with scores for different domains, because we make these inferences about domains, our scores come out very close to preceding efforts. And it also predicts out of sample party registration pretty well. So who saw fake news? There are two elements to note here. We're looking at we're categorizing the people as extreme right to extreme left. We see that in terms of exposure levels, that people on the right, and the more right wing you are, the more you more likely you are to see fake news. But also that there is an age gradient, that the older you are, the more likely you are to see fake news. More generally, the more exposure you have to political information, the higher the fraction of what you see is fake news. So, like, again, that fits with this notion of a particular element of activism in a particular, especially in particular on the right, as being a potential driving force here. We see something similar on the sharing patterns, unsurprisingly, that if people on the right are much more likely to share fake news than people on the left. Interestingly, then we could evaluate I'll put quote. I should have put quotes around viral here. Like, if something was potentially in your news feed, what was your likelihood of then subsequently retweeting it? And here we could say, if you're on the left versus if you're on the right, how much, if you're on the left, does it matter if it's fake versus non-fake, versus is it left-wing content, congruent content versus incongruent content? And roughly the takeaway here is that congruency seems to matter more than fakeness. That on the left, we're looking here at Democrats. Democrats are much more likely to share congruent content than fake content than incongruent fake content. And same goes with Republicans, although it's not, there's a huge error bar here for incongruent content because there's so little, there's relatively little left-wing fake news, and very little of it actually goes to people on the right. So it happens so infrequently that we just get a very large error bar. But then similarly, we see, especially more so on the left, but we see it for both people on the right and the left, that for hard news, that there is a big difference between congruent and incongruent hard news. Resharing, retweeting, should it be potentially in your feed. So here it just seems like in fake versus hard matters less than congruent versus incongruent. Final point on this, which is, how does this fit into the overarching information ecosystem? And where does fake news fit within that broader ecosystem? And the thing we could do here is, since we're watching the same people over time, we could look at what people are being exposed to. And if you're being exposed a lot to Fox News and Breitbart, then we should think of those as being linked. And if we think of the New York Times and Washington Post as being shared a lot, we should think of those as being linked. And there are methods in network science to extract, I won't go into it now, but to extract the backbone, because basically everything has some links to everything else, but you want to look at things that have especially strong linkages. And so we come up with this kind of network. it's color coded by whether it's Democratic or Republican. So blue sites are more seen by more Democrats, red by more Republicans. The edges mean that that two sites are seen by the same people a lot, and then they're filled in based on whether they're fake or not. So here are obviously a lot of right-leaning fake news sites, and here are a number of left-leaning fake news sites. And what we see, and I'll put some labels on some of these, is that there is a mainstream cluster which accounts for the large majority of what people see. So it contains the Washington Post, the New York Times, Fox News, and then there's a large cluster of fake news sites that are being seen by the same small set of people over and over again. And this accounts for, again, relatively little of what people are seeing. You can even see things that are bridging, like the Daily Caller, are things that are trying for more of a mainstream presence, but they're in some sense bridging. They're definitely false content, but they're sort of in the space between. So in any case, this gives you some sense of the, and I should note these nodes are sized by how much people are exposed to them. And unsurprisingly, people are a lot more exposed to the New York Times, say, than a lot of these fake news sites. So 2020, and for COVID, we don't have the election done yet. Hell, the country doesn't have the election done yet. We do want to replicate our study for 2020. We had been already looking at COVID news and looking at a specially curated set of websites that have been identified by third parties as sharing a lot of COVID misinformation. And we also have this survey, and I'll point people to covidstates.org, that has reports in both some of the Twitter stuff as well as the survey. And so it's interestingly, we see some similar results, and some different results. So we definitely see big partisan differences still between Democrats and Republicans. Interestingly, independents are, well, they're generally in between, but they may be somewhat closer, certainly here, to Republicans than Democrats. But there's a big difference on the order of, tenfold, 8 to 10-fold difference between Democrats and Republicans in terms of fake news sharing regarding COVID-19. And again, we see an enormous age gradient that older than 65, but it's like a monotonic relationship, and it's true for Democrats and Republicans, that older voters are more likely to share misinformation about or fake news regarding COVID-19. Interestingly, when we surveyed people and we asked them about misbeliefs, beliefs in the wrong information, we actually find a different pattern of results. We do see a similar partisan differences. It's just the magnitude is way different, right? This is like, a 10% or 20% difference between Democrats and Republicans, not a 10-fold difference. And the age result is inverted entirely, that we find older people are less likely to have misbeliefs and younger people more likely. So we're still wrestling, and there are a whole bunch of reasons why this might be. Obviously, it's different people in our survey, different types of people in our survey than on Twitter. And it could be, again, my own hypothesis is that a very particular segment of the population has been mobilized for sharing fake news and misinformation. But like I said, we're still working on this sort of seeming paradox. So a few conclusions. At its peak, fake news sources accounted for a non-trivial amount of stuff, and I didn't show you the pictures with the peaks, but the very peaks in leading up to the election, close to 1 to 5 in 5 political URLs being shared was fake news. And we really do think these are people and not bots that are sharing and consuming. Of course, I'm sure bots are also sharing fake news, and some of what we're looking at the consumption side may be in part driven by bots. It's just we're on the sharing side, and the exposure side we're focusing on humans. But in some sense, this was a problem of not so much a systemic problem with Twitter as much of as a fact that there's a very seedy neighborhood of Twitter that around 1% of people accounted for 80% of exposure, and around 0.1% accounted for 80% of the sharing. And again, we found these pronounced demographic patterns, and we saw this sort of selective sharing patterns and co-consumption patterns for fake news. It does have sort of potential, and again, this is sort of talking about translational applications, potential implications for designing Twitter and interventions and for detecting fake news. So I'm going to end there. I realized I talked more than I meant to, and I had said I had a hard stop, but I actually can run a few minutes over to those, for those who are, you know, interested in sticking around till 1:10. Like I said, I was able to delay, you know, my next Zoom meeting. But in any case, I appreciate you all listening, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, David. And it's great that you can stick around for a few minutes. Just you know, let us know when you do have to go. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and if folks have any additional ones, feel free to type them in. The first one is from the Tanya Berger-Wolf, the director of TDAI. Who said, "This is a great example of coming together of social sciences and computational methodologies and theories. Can you comment on the broader approach of computational social sciences and how the computational and social can and should come together in a good way?"
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It is, you know, there are interesting challenges there because I think that there are different priorities in terms of publishing and epistemology. I do think that part of the lesson there is talking and thinking about what's important and interesting. I think that we, in the social sciences, we've thought a lot about issues of validity and reliability and measurement and so on, which honestly has not been so much a focal point on the computer science side. So I think the notion of why we want to homogenize our sample, you know, not shocking to a social scientist, but like a lot of the social media research in computer science is like, well, we can look at lots of tweets and let's see what the patterns are. But there are real issues when we think, are those real people? Are they regular people? Where's most of the content coming from? And so I think that part of what with computational social science, that you need to create this fusion of sensibilities and thinking about what signals are being pulled out of computational methods. And some of that, so I think that one of the things is that I think we need social scientists who are trained in more computational methods, but I also think that we need computer scientists who want to work with human data to at least take some social science 101 courses, because I think that we need a bridge. Right now we're too far apart, and we need to train some people are in the middle, but we also need to have computer scientists who are at least sensitive to the basic issues there, and we need some social scientists who can do some at least basic computation themselves. And I think the world has moved a fair way in that direction in the last decade, but we have a lot further to go.
Another question from Alex Thompson in the political science department. Do we know why fake news is more common and more likely to be shared on the political right?
We do not. I mean, I think there are various hypotheses why, and of course, part of this is we often see big differences in media consumption across political ideology. Like talk radio is dominated on the right. In some sense, one could argue that that fake news is the direct descendant of talk radio in certain kinds of ways. I mean, literally, that's where some of these, some of the fake news sites are really actually talk, you know, have talk radio elements to it. So I do think that there's sort of this interesting path dependence, and otherwise, you know, I also think that there are different tactics, political tactics adapted on the left versus the right. And I think, and so we're still digging into that. Why the pronounced difference, though?
Okay. Third question from Caroline Wagner. What is your view on open data sharing? Some of these data would be helpful to others, but it would be possible to identify people, right?
That's right. So it's a challenge, and we've shared some elements of the data, and some elements we cannot. I mean, first of all, we're just prohibited from on Twitter to share certain kinds of data in terms of the user agreement, but there are deeper privacy and ethical issues, as well as issues with, well, we have data from a data vendor under a data use agreement, and we can't just put all the voter data up there as well. So even though some voter data are public, and so we do have certain aggregates of the data available, and that were the basis for our analyses. We just don't have the individual level data that we can post, and certainly and that's not an ideal solution. It's just the best we can do circa 2020.
Another question from Ryan Moore. I'm deeply interested in understanding why older folks appear more likely to share fake news on social media. You briefly mentioned an interesting hypothesis that this pattern is observed because this population may be mobilized to share. Could you expand on that?
Sure. Again, this is at the moment more of a speculative hypothesis, but my hypothesis is that there are different active kinds of political activity require different resources, right? We know that, right? That you can't contribute to campaigns if you don't have money. You can't. You have to have time, some flexibility of time to be active, to protest, and so on. And so there are pronounced demographic differences if you're looking at who is protesting, say, or who donates money, right? There are just very different demographics for those different categories. The kind of resources you need to be active on social media, in part, is time. But it may be that you don't need other things that require, let's say, protesting, which might require perhaps more physical energy, or even, like, honestly, like if you're out in the Black Lives Matter protests, like, are there bathrooms available during COVID-19 is a practical constraint, so in any case, my hypothesis partially is that older people, especially older women, may have more time available as a resource to actually be politically active in this way. But I could be wrong. But like I said, that sort of at least would fit with the nature of the data we're seeing, which is that it is disproportionately, say, women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s.
So another question from Adam Lorettig, a former graduate student we're glad to have come back for this talk. What can remove super spreaders of fake news? If you just excise a single user, does that help? Or do you need to deconstruct an entire subnetwork?
Well, it's a good question, because what you really need to know is the dynamic response, right? And these data cannot, you could just say, you know what, if you remove these 16 people and the top 0.1% from Twitter, then the amount of fake news being shared on Twitter would drop 80%. But of course, it's a cat and mouse game. And part of the interesting question is, how does the system adapt? I do think that there are, I do think, though, that if you, to the extent that you limit sharing by nonetheless, if you limit sharing by hyperactive actors who share lots of low quality information, that it will be a challenge for them to rebuild follower networks, that'll be continually limiting their reach, because it'll take a while to rebuild, and at that point they're deplatformed again. The other element is that you could imagine just limiting sharing behavior. Like, this isn't how you'd execute it, but you could say, let's just say people who can only share 10 tweets a day. Well, that would have dramatic effects on prevalence of fake news on Twitter because the super sharing as a flooding tactic relies on being allowed to flood the platform. And you could say you're not allowed to own that much of people's news feeds. And there are good democratic reasons why you want diversity and voice on a platform like on all platforms, that putting aside all what people engage with, that you want to spread around who is paid attention to. And it just happens that would have the side effect of substantially reducing the prevalence of fake news.
Excellent. Now, we have a couple more questions. I want to respect your time, though. You did say 10.
Unfortunately, I'm realizing I better leave it there, but I'll be happy to share. Also, I saw the question about the papers. I'll be happy to share, of course, the papers that this talk was drawing from, and great questions. And Bear, and great to have you host Bear. Bear was both someone, colleague in grad school and a colleague at Harvard for years. So it's lovely also to see you. And I saw Chris was around, Chris Delpy, who was also an old grad school friend, actually my cohort at Michigan, if I'm allowed to say Michigan in this crowd. So
yeah, it's a little dicey around here. So thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you here, and thank you immensely for helping us put together this memorial to Brice. It really means a lot to a lot of us.
It was very meaningful. Thank you. It was particularly an honor, and I thank you for having me. And I wish everyone well. I wish everyone to take good care of themselves in these difficult days. So,
and I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care, and thanks to everyone who attended.